Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us. And look around, see our guests here. Thank you for joining us today. Hope that you found a warm welcome here at the Kettering Church. And we just appreciate you coming by and encourage you when our service ends. Don't leave. Don't run out the door. Just stay here for a little bit. Get to know us. We'd appreciate that. We just thank you for being here. Excited to be here with you today. Spend this time together. Thanks, Rich, for reading those two passages out of the book of Proverbs. As we began our 2019 curriculum a few months ago, we laid out 3 teaching objectives for the quarter, and we talked and have talked a lot about over the last few months the importance or the relevance of asking about tomorrow. What about tomorrow? There are things going on inside the culture right now that give us very much cause for concern. And we talked a little bit about that on our webcast this morning with where things are headed in the culture. There are definitely things that make us nervous about the future. And the question is how prepared are we individually for this and as a family, at our home, and in the church? And we've talked about how all good preparation begins with self-examination. We spent a lot of time on pages 6 and 7 in our vision book looking at things and areas in our life that we need to be growing in and where we're at in those areas right now. We have encouraged you to spend time in prayer and in personal reflection. And in our auditorium class, we have spent a lot of time in trying to equip you with a set of tools to help you bring positive change into your life. For example, how do you respond to the things that are going on in your life? Are you taking responsibility for yourself and eliminating negative thoughts, self-defeating thoughts? We've asked you to write your personal mission statement out for yourself and envision where you want to be down the road. And we spent time talking about how to manage your time to get the really important things in your life accomplished and help those things become more of a reality. Now, as we move into the month of February, our goal is to help you to build a spiritual life plan that is going to help you navigate this world and ultimately be ready for the life that is to come. And I'm really excited about this opportunity. And today what we're going to do is begin with the first step in building that spiritual life plan. And we're going to challenge you today about what you believe about yourself. Our game plan today is pretty simple. We're going to do 6 things. We're going to talk about what you think matters. We're going to base that off of 2 Bible passages that Brother Rich just read from. We're going to talk about 2 types of thinkers and limiting beliefs. We're going to talk about how to upgrade your beliefs, revise those beliefs, and in the lesson we're talking about how Christianity begins through the transformation of your mind. So on the back page of today's church bulletin, there is an outline that's been prepared. There's a place for you to take notes. There's questions there to give consideration to as we go through the lesson. There are fill-in-the-blanks that you can use as we go throughout the lesson. Use that as a study tool as we begin our lesson today. So I want to start off by just trying to acquaint us with this thought. What you think matters. And I want to take you back to Proverbs for just a minute. And I want us to read verse 23 again, where Solomon is writing here, and he says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it is the source of life." Now, when you look at verse 23, I want you to give consideration to what fact about the heart is Solomon talking about here? Well, he's talking about the personality of the individual. And notice here how the Holman Christian Standard Bible uses the term source. The heart is the source of life. I want you to think for a moment about a wellspring. And that's the idea here. From that fresh flowing water flows. Well, from our heart, our life flows. That's the imagery that Solomon is using here. And our heart gives us the capacity to live with joy and vigor and happiness apart from our circumstances. That's the message here from Proverbs 23, or Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23. Guard your heart above everything else, for from it is the source of life. Now, this other passage that Rich read a moment ago, this is the first part of verse 7 of Proverbs 23, and I'm reading it out of the New American Standard because some of the newer versions have changed up the way the first part of verse 7 reads, but here it is, for as he thinks within himself, so he is. So, what's interesting here is you read verse 7, reading out of the New American Standard Version, there's a footnote in my Bible that says, as a person reckons in his soul, so he is. So the Bible has much to say on this. Your thoughts matter. Your self-talk matters. And I want to question you. What are you telling yourself every day? What's going on with your self-talk? I think one of the reasons that we don't succeed as much with self-improvement is that we doubt we can. We tell ourselves we can't. We tell ourselves that we have failed so many times before. We tell ourselves there is no use in going forward. And sometimes, I've heard this through the years when preachers preach on resolutions or preachers preach on setting goals or self-improvement, that sometimes it causes the eyes of brethren to just roll back in their head. Because we've heard this over and over and over again through the years. And if that is you, if you're just rolling your head at all this series of lessons, I want to suggest to you this morning you may be governed by limiting thoughts. A few years ago, one of our former deacons, Murray Collier, introduced me to Michael Hyatt's blog and writing, and way back in 2011, at the beginning of the decade almost, Murray shared with me some material on building a life plan. And I read through it, and then somehow it got deleted off my computer. I don't know what happened, but it just happened, and no, it's not because I use a Mac. It just happened. I lost it. But we went into our vision planning process last year. I mentioned this to the elders about the idea of doing a spiritual life plan. And I found that Michael Hyatt had revised his material and has now published a book called Your Best Year Ever. And I had actually downloaded this book on my Kindle early last year, but only briefly looked at it. And so last month, I dove into the book again. And I'm going to be pointing to this book a lot over the next 4 weeks because in the book, what Hyatt writes about is a lot of good personal stories that can help us on self-improvement. One of the first things he does is he talks about an out-of-control dog he used to have. I got a couple of dachshunds at home, as you know, and they love to be inside, but when they get in their mind that it's time to go outside, they sit by the door and they whine, and they complain, and they just beg, and they're just ready to go outside, and you let them out. And our little tiniest dachshund, she just shoots out with a bark, and she's fierce, and you just think she's ready to eat you alive. And then they get out there, and they play around, and they run around. We've not ever had a problem with them running away, but sometimes people have problems with their dogs running away. And they have to put in an invisible fence. Now, a lot of you know what an invisible fence is, right? It's where you go out, and you put this wire underground, and there's an electric collar on the dog that sends vibrations to the dog when he gets close to that boundary. And we'll just leave it at that. But have you ever had a dog, maybe you have an invisible fence, and maybe your dog has had that boundary in its head for so long that now it's just gotten so used to it that he doesn't even need the collar anymore. He just knows that when he gets at a certain point in the yard, he better stop. Because if he doesn't, that sensation that he does not like is going to start happening. But he doesn't have the collar on because he's been trained. It's in his mind. There is a limiting thought there that's stopping him when actually there is no barrier there to begin with. The barrier's been literally removed, but it doesn't matter because he thinks it is still there. You see, it is the belief that is actually prohibiting from doing what is actually possible. Now, think about that for just a minute. And think about how this plays a role in our lives as far as we have certain beliefs that we think are real, but in reality, there is no barrier there, but it stops us every single time. A few years ago, there was a survey out by Harris International, and it revealed that 80% of millennials set resolutions, while 70% of baby boomers say setting resolutions is a waste of time. Now, what do you think about that? Do you think there's some truth in that, depending on where you are generationally right now? Well, usually, the reason we have the difference in generational outlooks on that is that the older you are, the greater number of setbacks you've had in life, and the less likely you are to feel that you can prevail. And so doubt becomes a toxin to your goals. And so the older we get, many of us have a large history of not getting exactly what we want in life. And to shield ourselves from the hurt, we just move towards cynicism and self-protection. You know, we've tried to step out in the past, and we've just gotten zapped so many times by that barrier that we've just stopped and quit trying. And in our minds, we may think that barrier is really there, and in many cases, it's strong enough in our mind to keep us stuck. And so I want you to think about this spiritually for just a moment. I want you to think about your spiritual goals. What are your spiritual goals? For example, a wife sitting in this room today may say, well, you know, I want to look into some ways to make my marriage better. And then she thinks to herself, well, how's that going to happen when I can't even get him motivated to do anything? How is that going to be possible? I might as well just sit back and I'm going to settle for mediocrity. I'm going to settle for indifference. In fact, I met with a sister recently in a different place who was talking to me, reflecting over her marriage of a number of years, and said, you know, I just grew to be indifferent. I just gave up. I just was satisfied with the mundane. That happens in a lot of marriages because people just govern themselves to limiting beliefs. Maybe there's a man here saying today, you know, I'm really tired of this recurring sin in my life, and I want to kill it once and for all. And then he says to himself, well, yeah, but you know, you'll fail this time just like you have the last 300 times in your life. And then the struggles and disappointments and guilt continue indefinitely. Maybe there's some parents here today. They say that this is the year. They're going to work together on family togetherness. They're going to work together on being the spiritual family they need to be. And then one of the kids brings home another school or sports activity, and they say to themselves, well, why even try? The calendar just keeps getting more and more stacked. We're just going to have to wait till next year. And the frustration and the worry mount. And then someone else here today may be saying, well, I want to dive into the Word of God, and I want to make it really applicable to daily life. And in your back of your mind, you're saying, am I crazy? I don't have enough education for that. Where am I going to find the time to every day get into this stuff? There's no way I can do that. Those limiting thoughts are real. People deal with those all the time. And so it's very hard to get your hopes dashed if you never get them up to begin with. Our thoughts can make us more cynical than we realize. Cynicism poisons our souls, and it sabotages our results. Listen, obstacles are a part of life. Everybody has to face them. Everybody has to deal with them. And limiting beliefs cause us to keep from overcoming them. Liberating truths, however, cause us to transcend those obstacles and to improve our circumstances. Michael Hyatt in his writing has said the first key difference between an unmet goal and a personal success is the belief that it can be achieved. And I want to take you back to what Solomon says back in Proverbs 23, for as a person thinks, for as one reckons in his soul, what? So he is. Your thoughts matter. And so the question really comes down to this. Who am I going to choose to believe? What am I going to choose to focus on? Am I going to focus on what God promises, or am I going to focus on my own limiting self-talk? Sir John Lubbock in his writing has said how little we see. What we do see mainly depends on what we look for. So, brothers and sisters, our thoughts matter. Now, here's something else that is interesting, and I mentioned this in the Bible class out here in the auditorium this morning. It is interesting to me how a lot of times what we're teaching in the Bible class fits in so well with what we're talking about in the sermon time, and how a lot of times this just happens unplanned. And today is another one of those examples. I think we all know individuals that derive significance from being wronged. You know anybody like that? They enjoy taking offense. They enjoy being offended. They get some kind of twisted satisfaction out of being wronged. They complain about everything. They don't believe anybody else can do anything right. And many times they feel that life is just rigged against them. The system is working against me. People don't like me. Well, in the book that I was reading this week, the author calls this scarcity thinking. And I want you to compare that to abundance thinking. And with that is the person who may be generous with his time or money. He greets you with enthusiasm. He is someone that's encouraging. And when that person leaves the room, you feel encouraged. That's the guy I want to be. And I hope it's the person that you want to be. And on the back, I put an insert in the bulletin. Now, those of you who are in the AM Bible class this morning, you're already familiar with that chart. And you can read through the chart on your own. Here it is on the screen. But I want you to take this home. If you have homework today, this is it. Read through the screen, read through this chart, and I want you to see which side of the chart describes me the most. Which type of thinking am I giving myself into most often? And the key here that I want you to see, brothers and sisters, if you are going to make positive, lasting changes in your life, it is going to begin by understanding the distinction and intentionally choosing one way over the other. This is the first step in creating your spiritual life plan. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these limiting beliefs that can plague us, because people who are scarcity thinkers often are driven by distorted beliefs of the world and others and themselves. And I want to ask you this: how do you look at the world? Think about this in this regard. Do you view those in authority with suspicion and questioning their motives, believing that they're only there to take advantage of you or to hurt you in some way? If that is the case, you may be a scarcity thinker. And while people are out there, obviously, that do thrive on taking advantage of others, thoughts like these are not often rooted in reality. Well, how do I look at other people? That's another question I need to ask. Somebody says, well, you know, that person must be really upset with me. They haven't returned my phone call. They haven't returned my text message. That person, he's just too busy. He's just too busy to meet with me. Or, these people would never have anything to do with me. There's no way I could ever be like one of them. What do you think about other people? Again, sometimes these thoughts are necessary, but they are not always rooted in truth. And then, how do I look at myself? Sometimes I might tell myself, well, I never get around to finishing what I start. And you know, I never lose weight no matter how hard I work, and I've really never been that good with money. And on it goes. These beliefs are often a half-truth or even false in of themselves. And if you keep thinking on those things, it is going to be a roadblock to your progress of life. And so the question is what gets us here? What gets us here? Well, a lot of times it could be with black and white thinking. The idea that, well, I have just failed because I haven't accomplished this in every single possible way. I am not perfect. I didn't do this perfectly. I didn't do this exactly right, and so therefore I failed. Black and white thinking. It's self-defeating. Or something happens and I just take it personal. I take everything personal. Even though it may not have been directed toward me, I just take it that way. We need to quit blaming ourselves for every single thing. Or sometimes people think catastrophically and they assume the worst out of every situation with very little evidence to support it. And finally, others often think about a situation where they universalize everything. They take one bad experience and they apply it to every single other situation. So these are not good ways to go about. Where do we get all this stuff? Where does it come from? Well, I can tell you a lot of it comes from the news. Think about it. This morning, I left the house a little bit before 7. I had Fox News Channel on in my truck. I listened to it for about 5 minutes. And I finally just had to say, I'm done with this. I am not starting my day out with this junk. Because that's what it is, junk. Okay? When you think about the current political discussions that are going on, should a man resign or should he not resign? It's just sophomoric, freshman-style junk. Did you know studies reveal that an overabundance of news can make us depressed, anxious, and drive us toward feelings of helplessness and cynicism? Is that news to you? I mean, really? I mean, we know that's true. And you think about it, there's a lot of things we hear on the news we have no ability in and of ourselves to change. There's no way we could dive into some of those situations and fix it. So news media is definitely a negative source. And then think about social media. How often that is just a negative stream, constant negative stream. You want to talk about fake news? Check your social media stream. Constant information about the lives of others that make us feel like we don't add up. And it makes us feel like we're not as good as everyone else. This quote I found interesting. Donna Freitas, in her book, The Happiness Effect, says, Facebook is the CNN of envy. A kind of 24/7 news cycle of who's cool, who's not, who's up, who's down. And unless you have rock-solid self-esteem or impervious to jealousy or have an extraordinarily rational capacity to remind yourself of what everyone else is doing when they post their glories on social media, it's difficult not to care. Think about that, brothers and sisters, for the next time you're running through your social media feed. But this impacts us in the way we think and look at ourselves. And then negative relationships. Hang around people who are negative and you too will be negative. Hang around people who are positive and you too will one day be like them. So make the decision to intentionally move toward abundance. So now I want to move into the part, we're going to go back to the Old Testament and talk about how we can upgrade our beliefs. Listen, whatever circumstance you find yourself in today, you can have the power to upgrade your future. Don't give in to this limiting belief that says since you can't control everything, that you can't change anything. Don't do that. By our choices, we become active participants in the outcomes that we experience. This is interesting. I've been preaching 25 years and never read one of Martin Luther King's sermons, but I came across one this week. Went back, pulled it out in the archives. I mentioned this in the bulletin article. Sermon was Living Under the Tensions of Modern Life, given in 1956, and here's what Martin Luther King says. Lord, help me to accept my tools. However dull they are, help me to accept them. And then, Lord, after I have accepted my tools, then help me set out and do what I can with my tools. I want you to hold that thought in your mind for just a minute, because although in this sermon King doesn't go into detail, he mentions Moses, who shed his limiting beliefs. And I wanted to take you back to Exodus for just a minute, because this is a perfect example. Go back with me to Exodus chapter 3 and verse 10, and I want you to see the monumental task that God gives Moses. He says, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh for what? That you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, I want you to just to put yourself for a second in the shoes of Moses. You've already had to flee Egypt because you've killed Pharaoh's son. You fled for your life. You've been out in Midian for the last 40 years. God appears to you and says, oh, I'm going to have you lead my people out of Egypt. Really? Me? I mean, can you imagine putting yourself in his shoes? It's no wonder why we have the dialogue that we do going through the next chapter, into the next chapter. Look at verse 11. What's Moses? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Then notice verse 13. I don't know what to say. How are they going to know who I am? How are they going to know that you have sent me? What shall I say to them? If you go on down a little bit further, chapter 4 and verse 1, well, they're not going to hear me. They're not going to listen to me. They're going to say, God didn't send you. And if you keep going here, verse 10, here Moses says, listen, I'm not a good speaker. I don't know what to say. I haven't been a good speaker in the past, and I haven't been a good speaker since you spoke to me. I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue, and by the time you get to verse 13, he just says flat out, Lord, just send somebody else. Now, you want to talk about limiting beliefs? Because in every situation, go back to chapter 3 now, look again at verse 12. What does God say? God says, I know you're thinking, who am I to do this? God says, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. Look at verse 14. I know I don't know what to say. God says, say this to the people. I'll tell you what to say, and here is exactly what you need to say. Moses says, well, they're not going to believe that you sent me. Well, take this staff with you. And by that, we're going to do some signs to prove to the people that you are legitimate, that you are my servant. Do that. Notice if you go back to verse 14, he's going to say, well, I just send somebody else. God says, well, is not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know he can speak well. In every one of these instances, notice how God has an answer. Brothers and sisters, may I put this out there? If we will listen, God has an answer to every one of our limiting beliefs. And the question again comes down to, who am I going to trust, God or my own self-talk? And by the way, this is a recurring theme in Scripture. Ask Isaiah and Jeremiah about what God did for them and how God led them. What was Paul's message to the church in Ephesus? Go with me to Ephesians chapter 1. Look with me, if you will, at verse 19. The whole emphasis in chapter 1 is that God has equipped us with power. And he's trying to get the Christians to realize that the same power that was in Jesus to raise him from the dead, that same power is in us. And notice what he says, that you will come to know what is the immeasurable greatness of his power toward us who believe. That's you. That's me. According to the working of his great might, with that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at the hand of the heavenly places. Listen, brothers and sisters, Paul is saying that same power that raised Jesus from the dead, that is in you. Look at chapter 3 and verse 20. He says, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to what? The power, where? At work in us. That's amazing. So brothers and sisters, I don't know what you're facing in your life, and I do know some of the things that some of you face. But we have passages like this that stress to us the possibility of God going to work in our life. In his sermon, King says, we have in life this responsibility to be sure that we are willing to face our capacities as they are and to do the best that we can with them. And that's all that God requires. That's all that stands before you, is to do it well. And when you stand before the judgment of all eternity, there is great reward. This is true for the 2-talent man and the 5-talent man, and it would have been true of the 1-talent man had he used it. Go with me to Matthew chapter 25 for just a second. Let's look at this. We know the story. This is not our first time in Matthew 25 with the parable of the talents. To one he gave 5 talents, to another he gave 2, to one he gave 1, each according to his own ability. And you know the rest of the story. Look at verses 16 and 17. The one who had 5 talents went out and made 5 more. The one who had 2 talents went out and made 2 more. And then verse 18. But the one who had received 1 talent went and dug it in the ground and hid his master's money. Of course, verse 21, verse 23, the master returns. He sees the men with the 5 talents who gained 5 more, and the man who gained 2 talents and gained 2 more. He blesses them. He says, well done. Enter into the kingdom. But then he confronts the 1-talent man. And I want to take you to verse 24 and 25. I want you to see, as you read those 2 verses, what limiting beliefs do you see here? I can tell you when you focus on verse 24, I want you to see blame shifting. I mean, he accuses the master of being hard and dishonest and uncaring. And master, it's your fault I didn't get anything done. And think about this in real life, what we do anymore. Somewhere a wife is saying, it's my husband's fault that my marriage is sour. And somewhere a church member is saying, well, it's the elder's fault or the preacher's fault that I'm not growing spiritually. Or it's the church's fault when my kids don't turn out. We blame shift. And listen, while others aren't perfect, we've got to quit using that as an excuse for our own failure to take personal responsibility for the life we live. And then notice verse 25, he says, I was afraid. Maybe this guy tried before and failed. Maybe he listened to his own negative self-talk and believed it. But listen, whatever the case, whatever the source for this, I want you to look specifically at verse 26 and verse 30 and notice what Jesus calls this man. He calls him wicked, he calls him slothful, and he calls him worthless. Now, let's go ask the one-talent man if it matters what you think. Let's go ask the one-talent man if your own negative self-talk can lead you toward a very long eternity filled with pain and regret. This matters. So how do I revise my beliefs? How do I do that? 6 ways. And you notice the handout I had in the bulletin? This is where, you don't have to do this in the sermon now, but I really want you to kind of pay attention over the next 2 or 3 minutes as I go through this. Because this is where we go to work and writing down and building our spiritual life plan. This is the first step. I've got to recognize my limiting beliefs. Am I thinking black and white? Am I looking for perfection? Have I generalized something? Have I made something universalized? Maybe it's just an opinion about reality. Maybe it's not true. But I've got to recognize what my limiting beliefs are, and then I've got to write it down. And that's the whole purpose of the front side of that handout in the bulletin. I've got to write it down. Listen, write it down. I'll always fail eventually. I've failed 300 times at trying to lose weight. That's one I would write down. Or maybe more. There's not a day goes by I don't think about it. I'm terrible at self-discipline. I can't handle money. I don't have time to serve others. Whatever your thoughts are, I'm too busy to deal with my own problems. Get out a notebook, get out this piece of paper, and write those thoughts down. And the point here is to externalize those thoughts and give you the freedom to evaluate them. And then, if you write those things down, review it. And ask yourself, are these thoughts empowering? Are they actually helping me to make improvement in my life? Or is it just reinforcing my misery and regret? Because when I externalize my belief, it allows me to confront it. Then I've got to reject it or reframe it. If something that you're believing is false, reject it. If there's a kernel of truth in it, then you've got to accept that and try to reframe it from a way that makes it more positive. Someone has said when we obsess on what is wrong, we miss what is right. And then revise it. And this is where we reorient our thinking around the more liberating truth. Think about it in this way. For the person that says, I will always fail eventually, how could you revise that? How could you rewrite it? Well, you could say this. Failure is a part of the process. And I see where I failed, I understand why, and now I'm going to make the necessary adjustments to succeed. What about the person who says, well, I can't handle money? How can I revise that? Well, maybe I say, well, everybody at some time has struggled with money. There's no shame in it. I have all the tools. I have all the books. I have people around me who are willing to help me, and I can develop the needed discipline to win. Or what about the person who says, I don't have time to serve? Well, I'm going to start small. I'm going to start small. I'm going to start with a phone or a phone call or a card. I'm going to spend 10 minutes out of my week to focus on someone besides me. 10 minutes. You got 10 minutes in a week to do something for somebody else? Yes. And then you reorient yourself to the new beliefs. You begin living from the new perspective of this liberating truth. And every time the old limiting thought comes up, you reject it, you reframe it, you say, no more. I'm going to start living as if this is true, because the more I do it, the more I'm going to start living in line with my expectations. Brothers and sisters, may we all see that this is where Christianity begins. It begins with what we think. Turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 for just a second. What does Paul say here? If anyone is in Christ, what? He is a new creation. Where do we live this out every day of our life? In our mind. In our mind. That's where that is reality. I am a new creation. I am a new person. I have been born again. What's old is gone. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. At the very core of Christianity, where it begins in our mind. Notice what Paul says here in this passage. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by what? By the renewal of your mind. That's where Christianity begins. I've got to redefine myself by the actions and activity of Christ. It starts in the mind. This is why Paul says what he does in Philippians chapter 4. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, think on these things. How do I do that? Where's the main source of what I'm thinking on that's good and uplifting? Well, it's the Word of Christ. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16, and it is to dwell within me richly, Paul says. And then notice this, because this is where it all comes down to. This is all at the beginning of my spiritual life. When I give my heart and my mind over to the Lord, remember, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it springs your life, right? Notice what Jesus says. Whoever believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. So what you think matters. What do you believe about yourself? You know, the greatest thing we're told in Scripture is that we can be made free, we can be made whole. Maybe you're sitting with us today and you're thinking, there's no way God could ever forgive me. There's no way I could ever get my life turned around. There is no way that this is going to work for him. It always works for everybody else, but never me. Not according to this. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Listen, if you've gotten off track spiritually, or you've never been on track spiritually, it doesn't matter where you've been, it doesn't matter what you've been into, you can always come to the cross. And there's no time like today to start on the new path. If we can help you this morning get started in your new life, all things are ready. Quit limiting yourself with your limiting beliefs. Quit listening to your negative self-talk. Believe in what God is saying to you through the power of His Word, and get in there and follow through, because He will make you whole. He will make you new. He will make you like His Son. If we can help you today, all things are ready. Think about where you stand before God. If we can serve you in any way, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.